One of my favourite species to target really during our autumn and winter here in the UK is the Grayling. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the methods that I use and the water that we look at to target this wonderful species. So a little bit about the actual tackle that we use to target the Grayling. Whilst they can get to some big sizes, 3 and even 4 pounds, generally we're targeting fish of between half a pound and a pound and a half. Our tackle doesn't need to be overly heavy, but there's some reasons why we pick specific items. First of all, I'm going to start with the type of rod that I use. Out of personal preference, I prefer a longer rod, 10 feet in length. This is partly to give us a lot of reach and allow us to hold our flies over particular currents, also to be able to take away any drag, and that extra length allows us to do that. One of the key things is going for a light line weight. Whilst we've touched on the fish not being as big, the other thing with the light line is it allows us to generate a lot of movement through the tip, allowing us to propel flies forward. Also, one of the reasons for using a long light rod is it allows us to use much thinner tippets that have a lighter breaking strain. Whereas if we were using a 5 or 6 weight rod, what we'd find is we were snapping the leader, but by using 10 foot and 3 weight, that softer tip just takes away a lot of the pressure that we put on and allows us to fight our fish successfully and hopefully land a very big fish. Moving away from the rod, we then need to balance the light rod. So we have quite a lightweight fly reel. Out of preference, I like the more modern wide arbor style. This stops our lines from coiling up and allows us a quick retrieve rate as well if we need to move spots quickly. Loaded on here is a modern Euro nymphing line, which is ultra low in diameter, running in this camo green and a slightly orange tip. This again allows us to present our flies gently, meaning that we're not spooking fish in crystal clear shallow water, but it also allows us to cast further with heavy nymphs, and it acts more like a spring loaded action and pulls the flies out. Leading on from there, what I tend to do is then attach a full 9 foot tapered leader. I prefer the real ones, but there's many out there. This allows us to transfer our energy down the leader and help turn over our flies. We then need to know how our flies have actually been eaten by the fish, so we need an indicator of some form. In clear water we can do this by sight, but in slightly coloured water or deeper water we then want a little indicator. So for this I actually use another piece of fly line, and this is multicoloured. This is actually two-tone and very bright. Rather than use the standard wool indicators or fish pimp style indicators, which hold our flies at a fixed depth, this allows us to adjust our depth of our flies quickly, but it's also less intrusive on the water's surface, meaning that we don't spook fish in ultra shallow water again. Moving on to the business end, fishing very light tippets. I mentioned with the rod that it allows us to fish light tippets. Here I go with 6 sets, even down to 7 or 8 sets, so very thin lines. We're talking 1, 2 and 3 pounds in breaking strength. Part of the reason for using these ultra thin lines is it allows our flies to sink very rapidly with less impact from the water. And then moving on from there, one of the vital things when using our multicoloured indicator is mucilin. This is a slightly worn pot, but it's a floatant that takes to line very well, and it allows us to actually make our leader sit on the top of the water, so any tapes are registered by a stopping or sudden drawing away of that indicator. Now that we've had a quick look at the tackle that I use, I'd like to look more at the business end, the actual bit that makes us catch the fish. So really there's two ways that I set up my rig for grayling. Firstly, we talked about the indicator material. Here I've actually tied up a couple of indicators and how I use them. You'll see very clearly the two-tone now, yellow running into this nice pink. And I've tied two loops on either end, and I've left the tags between a centimetre and a couple of centimetres long. We actually use these as another indicator when that's either floating on the surface or being held aloft. On the business end then, we've got our section of tippet that will run down to the fly. This will vary in length depending on the water depth and the water velocity, but also on how spooky the fish are. Sometimes we really need to get that indicator a long way away from the fish, and other times we can fish it very close. So here's just a standard, generally about 3 feet, and then we would tie one single nymph on, and we can use this for sight fishing or fishing in shallow, clear, fast water, and that works very effectively. And we would just grease that up, allow it to float back, and just wait for any jink away. The other way that I use this method is to then tie a slightly more complicated indicator. Here you'll see a series of knots that run along it, and actually the line is doubled up. I do this to make it more visible, particularly during the winter months when it's quite glary. As we all know, everything gets a bit harder to see, including the fish. And we've got a loop again at the top, a nice fat loop there, and a smaller loop at the bottom. And then I've run a tippet off here, very short to the first fly. And the reason we do this, particularly for fishing in deep water on windy days, we can put a heavy fly on this top dropper and it will help just anchor everything in place. Then, much longer, probably about 70 centimeters now, to our first main fishing fly. This will be probably our favorite fly for using for a particular species. You can do this for trout, but in terms of grayling, quite often I'll put a shrimp pattern on that one. And then shorter then, about 50 centimeters to the point fly. This will be our main anchor fly, so generally very heavy, generally a jig-shaped fly, and that will give us our depth, but we also want it to be a main fishing pattern. So in this case you've got two flies fishing in the taking zone, and one that's holding everything in place and making sure that you pick up those tapes when they happen. So we've looked at actually building the leader. Now we're going to look at putting the flies on the end. Here I've brought a slightly secret box of flies that I have. These are all very effective flies that I use during the autumn and winter months. And you'll see everything from bright garish colours, particularly for dirty water or dull days, to much more sort of sedate and quiet patterns on that side for when we're fishing ultra clear water, maybe on a sunny day. They each have their moment and they all vary in size quite a lot. When I was talking about fishing just a single fly at a time, I tend to fish more from this side of the box, the quiet flies. They can vary from various shrimp patterns all the way through to standard pheasant tails and small other flies like that. Moving more onto the deeper water flies, then we're going much more big jigs, colourful shrimp patterns, and even flies with double beads. There's really no grayling that's going to hide from us when we've got these flies on. So there we have it. We've looked at the tackle, we've looked at the leaders, and we've looked at the flies. Really, there's nothing stopping you from catching that next grayling. Whether it be this winter or next winter, I expect to see 1 or 2 big fish from you all. If you enjoyed my video today, please like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Please like and subscribe our page on YouTube.
Carry on.
I'll get this right one day. If you've liked and... I've got this, Pete.
Okay.
If you've liked this video, please like and subscribe our YouTube page. Still didn't get it right, did I?